I just wanted to ask a little bit about a week in the life of Noah, a week in the life of an ancient and modern historian. Could you walk through our listeners on what you do? What does your week look like?
Yeah. It depends largely on how many courses I'm taking that term. So usually it kind of averages it out at about having 1.5 essays, a week. And so thinking about that, for me, I'm someone that loves all the reading and probably spends not quite as much time as I should on the actual essay writing. But that'll mean that maybe let's just simplify it to a Monday to Sunday week. If I have one essay due on a Thursday and then have a few more days in the week left over, then I would do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I'd probably be in a library somewhere reading. I'm someone that loves kind of physical books, and I think Oxford's such a great place because it does actually have kind of every single physical book that exists in England. You can go to an interesting library and find it. And so I quite enjoy that. So I'll go to these libraries on my bike and then sit there all day, and I find that a lovely process. So I'll do that for, the first kind of 3 days. Then the Thursday will be my planning and writing day, and then usually have a tutorial the next day. So in this case on the Friday, and so that's quite nice. And I usually use those days as kind of a reset day where I don't do any work other than the tutorial itself, just because otherwise I feel like it becomes a bit too much. And then kind of interwoven in all this is everything else that you want to do in your life, which can be difficult, but I find really rewarding. And I do rowing. And so each morning, typically, or at least 4 times a week, there'll be a nice 6:30. You got to be on the water, so waking up at 5:30 to get there, kind of thing, and do that. And then Trinity, which is the college that I go to, has an incredible breakfast, so it's usually about sprinting back to try and get to there. And then I find it quite satisfying to then have kind of done sport, eaten, had a shower, be in a library by 9, kind of thing. And that for me is the way that I like to set out my day. And I think that's the main thing that you realize by going to Oxford, is that everyone has their own individual way that they like to set out their day. Some people, I mean, especially this last term, the weather was so good. There are some people who would refuse to do any work during the day, but would then spend from 8 p.m. until 2 a.m. in their rooms doing work. I think that sounds horrendous, and I couldn't possibly do that. Once I'm tired, that's it. I'm not doing any work. But it's very individual what ends up working for you. But yeah, I think people always do find their particular balance, and I find that it makes you kind of similar to, as you were saying about using kind of less social media, very intentional with your time, which I think is a very important skill for life in general. As you say, there is so much that is always trying to distract you. There are millions and billions of pounds spent on figuring out the most effective ways to take your attention. And so taking ownership of that and figuring out how you want to spend your time is such a vital skill. And so I think in some ways, although it's hectic, the kind of Oxford working week really lets you set that out for yourself.
Yeah, that point of intentionality is really spot on and quite interesting, because I think the one transition that I certainly noticed, having studied a humanities degree, is that during school, I wouldn't say you are completely independent. You know, you have your structured lessons, you're taught everything in the lesson that you need to know for the exam. And pretty much, you can go home and do a bit of revision, but ultimately you're learning what you've just been taught. Whereas when you get to university, the independent thought that you need to engage with on a day-to-day basis is vastly different from A levels. And so I just wanted to ask a little bit on how have you found that transition from teacher-led learning to self-led learning at Oxford?
Yeah, well, it varies, as you said, depending on your subject, but especially for the humanities. I mean, so for chemistry, for example, they have kind of 2 lectures every single day, and then they'll have labs that take up 2 of their whole days, and then it kind of is, you're carried along. But yeah, as you rightly pointed out, for the humanities, I mean, there have been terms where I haven't even had a lecture series that term, because they kind of vary when they are. So there have been points where I have had 1.5 contact hours a week. And so the rest of the time is entirely yours, which can mean that sometimes if you're slightly less responsible than you should be, that it suddenly all disappears and you have run out of time somehow, despite having so much available to you. But I think, again, I think it's a really important skill to know how you want to spend your time and organizing that. And so I think it's definitely a peculiar feeling to adapt to. And at the start, I think it's the main thing that people struggle with. And so sometimes it can be useful to kind of introduce to yourself an artificial structure. So some people will kind of, as I mentioned, being ready in the library at 9. For me, that doesn't really matter if it slips to 9:30 or whatever, or if I end up in a coffee shop instead of a library, whatever it is. But for some people, it will be, I will be in the library at 9 and I will leave the library at 5. And that's the structure that allows me to feel like my day is planned and kind of keep some of that organization while adapting to this new feeling of being taught by yourself, essentially.
Mhm.